Preston Wexley didn't lower his voice when he told a room of 200 people that the woman in the plain gray dress had no business standing among them. She was Naomi Vance. 27 that very night, though not a single guest knew it. A night shift ICU nurse with tired gray eyes and hands worn rough by 12-hour rounds, and the small framed gift she'd carried into that glittering charity gala had cost her weeks of quiet evenings to finish. "This is what you bring to a night like this?" he said into the microphone, and the laughter that answered him was the kind that feeds itself on someone weaker. He let the frame slip from his fingers, and it met the marble floor with a crack far sharper than glass that size should ever make. And then he snapped his fingers at security to walk her out of a celebration that was supposed to honor her. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice or beg for her dignity in front of strangers who'd already decided she wasn't worth a second glance. She simply knelt, gathered the broken frame into her steady hands, straightened her spine, and walked toward the doors with her chin held level. And it was exactly then, just as she reached the threshold, that those tall doors swung open from the outside, and every laugh in the room went out at once. Because the man who stepped through them was someone a handful of people in that ballroom recognized on sight, and the color drained from their faces before he'd said a single word. What none of them knew, what Preston Wexley couldn't have pictured even in his worst nightmare, was that the woman he'd just cast out into the cold was the wife of Kai Donovan, the most powerful and most feared man in the city, and he'd just made the one mistake that no amount of money could ever undo. Who was the quiet nurse nobody bothered to look at twice? And why had she guarded a secret that could have silenced that entire room in a heartbeat? Before we reach what happened when Kai Donovan crossed that floor, we have to go back past the party, past the shattered frame, to an ordinary life that hid something no one ever suspected. If a story about dignity, love, and the true measure of a person moves you, do us a favor and tap that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to where it all began. 9 months before that night, before any picture frame shattered across the marble floor, Naomi Vance lived a life no one in that glittering ballroom could possibly have imagined. A life measured in shifts rather than parties, in the steady beeping of heart monitors through the darkness rather than the clinking of champagne glasses. She worked the night shift in the intensive care unit of a public hospital in the heart of Chicago, where the fluorescent lights never went out, and time was counted by the fragile breaths of people suspended between life and death. While the rest of the city slept, she moved through the silent corridors with footsteps long accustomed to quiet, checking every line, recording every reading, sitting beside patients whose families had gone home hours earlier, and holding hands that had no one else left to hold them. She belonged to the kind of people the world passed without seeing, a gentle shadow, in pale blue scrubs, present everywhere yet never truly noticed by anyone, and she had grown so used to it that it no longer hurt. Naomi rented a small apartment directly above a laundromat in an old neighborhood, where the smell of soap and warm steam rose through the wooden floor every morning when she returned from her shift, and the steady turning of the washing machines below had become the sound that lulled her into daytime sleep, regular and comforting in a way silence never could be. The apartment was barely large enough for one person, with a single bed pushed against the window, a small table where she ate dinner alone, and a shelf crowded with old medical books she had bought secondhand for very little money. She paid her rent 3 days early every month, not because she had money to spare, but because it was the habit of someone who had learned very young that debt was a luxury she could never afford, that peace of mind was worth more than a good meal, and that one small mistake could be enough to bring her entire carefully constructed life crashing down. She owned exactly 2 sets of scrubs, one to wear and one to wash, rotating them week after week, each pressed so neatly that no one could have guessed how old they truly were. She had exactly one coat warm enough for Chicago's brutal winters, a gray coat faded at the elbows that she pulled around herself whenever she stepped toward the train station at 5 o'clock in the morning, when her breath turned to mist before her face, and the whole city still lay beneath the cold blue light of dawn. She had no car, no expensive wardrobe, no vacations like the ones her coworkers talked about in the break room, and she never allowed those absences to become complaints, because she had learned that some burdens, were best carried in silence. Her co-workers at the hospital cared for her, in the way people care, for something they can always depend on being there. They knew she would take the shifts no one else wanted, knew she would stay an extra hour to finish a report for a nurse rushing home to a young child, knew she remembered every patient's name and the names of their loved ones as well. But very few of them truly knew who she was beneath that calm exterior. Few had ever asked about her family, about the nights she went home alone, or about the reason her gray eyes always carried an old sorrow she never mentioned. She was the kind of person who listened to everyone else's stories, but never told her own, the one who comforted every pain while keeping her own locked behind a door she had stopped opening long ago. There was a stillness inside Naomi, not the stillness of a peaceful soul, but the stillness of someone who had endured enough to learn how not to let anything show on the outside, a steadiness forged through years in which she had never allowed herself to fall apart, because there was always someone who needed her to remain standing. And within all those ordinary details, no one ever thought worth noticing, not one person who passed her in the hospital corridor, not one neighbor who greeted her at the laundromat, and certainly not one guest at that gala could imagine that the quiet woman in the faded gray coat was hiding something capable of shaking their entire world, a truth she herself was protecting, with all the gentleness and patience life had taught her. To understand how a woman could carry such steady stillness within her, one has to go back even farther, back 11 years before that gala night, to another night Naomi had never truly left behind, no matter how deeply she had tried to bury it. She was only 16 then, and what she remembered most clearly wasn't an image but a sound. The fire alarm tearing through the quiet darkness of the neighborhood, shrill and merciless, the sirens of the fire engines racing toward them from far away, and drawing closer, closer until they filled the whole world and swallowed every other sound, even the frantic pounding of her heart inside her chest. She remembered the smell of smoke, the harsh, bitter odor that clung to her hair, her skin, and every fiber of her memory, remaining there for the rest of her life, a smell that years later could still make her freeze whenever she caught even the faintest trace of smoke from somewhere, forcing her to stand still for a few seconds and remind herself that it was over. That night took both of her parents from her and left behind something even heavier than grief, the question that would never have an answer, why she had survived when they hadn't, a question that followed her through all the years afterward like a shadow that refused to fade, whispering in her ear whenever she allowed herself to stop for too long. The only comfort she had during that terrible night was that her little sister, Ruby, who was only 8 at the time, had also made it outside safely, a small and fragile life that from that moment became all Naomi had left in the world, the only reason she refused to let herself collapse. After that night, the two sisters were taken in temporarily by a distant aunt, then moved through several different foster homes, places that gave Naomi a bed and 3 meals a day, but never gave her the feeling that she belonged, and throughout those uncertain years, she held tightly to one purpose alone, to wait until she was old enough to protect Ruby herself, until no system and no stranger would ever again have the right to decide her sister's fate. The moment she turned 18, when the law finally granted her the right her heart had longed for, Naomi formally became Ruby's guardian, placing on her 18-year-old shoulders the responsibility of someone she was far too young to become, and she carried it without a single complaint. Because to her, keeping Ruby beside her was a privilege, never a burden. It was during those years, while she spent endless hours in cold hospital waiting rooms, because of Ruby's fragile heart, a heart marked by a defect from birth and always threatening to betray her without warning, that Naomi found the path her life was meant to follow. She watched the nurses moving through the halls, people who remained calm in the middle of chaos, hands that knew how to soothe fear and fight for life, and she understood that this was what she wanted to become, not for glory or money, but for a reason buried much deeper, a longing to save the people she hadn't been able to save on that night of fire and smoke, as though every life she managed to preserve were a small piece of the debt she had placed upon herself and would continue paying for the rest of her life. She worked while she studied, exhausting part-time jobs woven between long nights of preparing for exams, and she graduated from nursing school later than most people her age, but she reached the end through her own effort, without anyone carrying her there. Of everything that remained from her old life, from the house that had burned to ashes, only one object had survived, her mother's ring, a thin gold band worn smooth by the years. The last keepsake connecting her to the people she had lost, and to a past she could now preserve only in memory. She treasured that ring for years, keeping it in the safest place she had, touching it whenever she needed to remember that she had once belonged to a family, until the day Ruby's medical bills piled so high that there was no other choice, and Naomi did the one thing she had never believed she could do. She took her mother's ring to a pawnshop and sold the last piece of her past in exchange for another chance at life for her sister, because to Naomi, a beating heart would always be worth more than any keepsake. And true love, she had learned very young, always meant knowing what one had to let go. It was during one of those night shifts so ordinary that there seemed to be nothing worth remembering, while the cold rain of late autumn poured over Chicago in heavy sheets, and the entire city seemed to draw inward beneath a blackened sky, that Naomi Vance's life turned in a direction she could never have foreseen, though at the time she had no idea. That night, after the clock had passed 3 o'clock in the morning, and the intensive care unit had sunk into a dense stillness, broken only by the steady sounds of machinery, a man in critical condition was admitted, carried through the emergency doors by quiet men dressed in dark clothing, who left quickly after setting him down, without offering a single explanation. He was admitted under a name she would later understand was false, carrying no identification, no address, no relative willing to claim him, only wounds across his body that told a story he wasn't conscious enough to tell for himself. Throughout the hospital, people whispered their theories, curious eyes lingering on the bed where he lay, lowered voices speculating about who he was, what he had become involved in, and whether someone should be called, because there was something about this man that made people both curious and afraid. But Naomi didn't whisper, didn't pry, and didn't judge. When she entered that room and looked down at the man, struggling through fever and pain, she didn't see a mystery that needed to be solved, or a danger that required caution. She saw only what she always saw in every patient who passed through her care, a human being who needed to live, and for her, that was enough. She did her work with the same calm devotion she always brought to it, changing his bandages with gentle hands, watching every number on the monitor through the longest hours of the night, wiping the sweat from his forehead when the fever rose, and sitting beside his bed during those moments when he drifted somewhere between waking and dreaming, not because duty required it, but because she couldn't leave another human being to fight alone in the darkness, no matter who he was. One night, when he suddenly woke from his delirium and his deep blue eyes opened, searching through the disorientation of someone who had returned from a very distant place, he looked at her with a suspicion so deeply rooted it had become instinct, and in a hoarse voice he asked what she wanted from him, who had paid her, as though in his world every act of care had to carry a price, and every kindness was an investment waiting to collect its return. Naomi looked at him for only a moment, then answered in a calm voice untouched by offense, telling him that in this place he didn't need to be anyone at all, didn't need to prove anything, that she didn't care where he had come from or what he was running from, because the only thing she saw when she entered this room was a man who needed to live, and that was all she needed to know in order to do her job well. The man, someone whose name would make an entire city tremble, someone accustomed to every gaze turning toward him, either in fear or in hunger for the power he possessed, lay silent for a long time after she said those words, because in all his adult life no one had ever looked at him this way. No one had ever treated him like an ordinary human being, rather than a name, a force, something to exploit or something to fear. He had lived too long in a world where he was seen only for what he could give or take away, until he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen simply because he was a man who was breathing, hurting, and alive. And the woman in pale blue scrubs, with gray eyes carrying an old sorrow, the woman who had learned through her own losses that every life had value, no matter whose life it was, had no idea that through her quiet tenderness on those rainy nights, she was touching something no amount of power and no sum of money in that man's world had ever been able to buy. Nor could she have imagined that her life had just bound itself to a man whose real name she didn't yet know. But to truly understand the man who had lain in that hospital bed, the man Naomi knew only by a false name and a body in need of healing, One had to leave behind the gentle fluorescent light of the hospital and step into an entirely different world. A world where kindness was a luxury and weakness was a death sentence. A few weeks after leaving the intensive care unit, when his wounds had healed enough for him to return to his work, Kai Donovan stood in the middle of an abandoned warehouse beside the Chicago docks late at night, where cold wind from the lake blew through gaps in the rusted metal roof, carrying with it the smell of stagnant water and the heavy silence found only in places where people came to settle, matters that were never meant to be spoken of, beneath the light of day. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, and the bearing of someone who had never needed to look up to anyone, his neatly cut black hair already touched with a few early strands of silver at the temples, and a faint scar running along the line of his jaw, the remnant of a past he never spoke about. But what truly frightened people wasn't his size or the scar. It was his eyes, blue and cold as unheated steel, eyes that could look directly into a person and read every lie, every fear, every hidden calculation. The eyes of a man who had learned very early that in his world, whoever blinked first was the one who lost. Before him that night knelt a man who had once belonged to him, someone who had sold secrets that weren't his to sell in exchange for favor from another power, and who was now trembling and begging in the language of someone who knew he had gone too far ever to return. Kai didn't shout, didn't threaten, and didn't reveal even the slightest flicker of anger, because anger was for men who didn't yet hold power securely in their hands, while he stood far too high at its summit to need any display at all. He simply stood there with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and spoke in a voice so low that the men around him had to hold their breath to hear. A voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather, saying that loyalty wasn't something that could be bought and sold like goods in a market, that a man had only one price to pay for betrayal, and that he had given this man more chances than anyone else had ever received. When he gave a slight nod, so small it was almost impossible to notice, the men standing behind him understood and led the traitor away into the darkness, and Kai turned his back before it was over, because to him, the moment a decision was made was the moment it had already been completed, and whatever followed was merely a consequence he didn't need to witness. That was Kai Donovan in the eyes of the world, a man whose slightest frown could decide another person's fate, the ruler of a kingdom that appeared on no map, governed through absolute control and a coldness no enemy dared to challenge. Beside him, standing quietly like a loyal shadow, was Elias Thorne, the silver-haired man who had served the Donovan family for 30 years, since the days when Kai's father still held power, and it was Elias who inclined his head and quietly warned him that rumors were moving through the darkness, that the Kessler family, their longtime rivals, had begun to suspect that the man with no weaknesses might be hiding one after all, a small opening in the armor he had spent his entire life building. Kai didn't answer, but when he walked out of that cold warehouse and settled into the waiting car, while the city drifted past the window, through the wet darkness, something very slight changed across his stone-cold face, because for reasons he couldn't understand, the image of a woman in pale blue scrubs with gentle gray eyes had returned to his mind, the woman who had told him he didn't need to be anyone at all. And for the first time in many years, the man without weaknesses realized that perhaps Elias was right. That man could have allowed everything to end there. He could have walked out of Naomi's life forever just as he had walked out of the hospital, without a farewell, and without leaving a trace, because in his world, connections were threads enemies could follow and tighten into a noose. But for weeks after the night at the docks, the image of the woman with gray eyes kept returning to him at the moments he least expected, in the middle of cold meetings and heavy decisions, until one evening, nearly a month after leaving the intensive care unit, Kai Donovan did something he had never done for anyone before. He went back to find her, not as a powerful crime boss, not with an entourage and a line of black cars, but simply as an ordinary man who wanted to thank the woman who had cared for him. He waited outside the hospital when her early morning shift ended, standing quietly in a plain coat among the hurried crowd, and when she emerged wearing the familiar exhaustion of a long night, he introduced himself as Adrian, a name that wasn't his but wasn't entirely a lie either, a piece of cover he wrapped around himself so that, even for a little while, he could become someone the underworld had never touched. They began with brief conversations, a cup of coffee in a small shop near the train station, A walk along the lakefront while the city was still half asleep, and the feeling between them grew slowly in the way the most lasting things always grow, without haste, without display, quietly taking root in the most ordinary moments. When she asked what he did for a living, Adrian said that he worked in transportation and finance, an answer vague enough not to be an outright lie, but guarded enough to protect everything he couldn't reveal. And Naomi, who had spent her life beside people carrying wounds and secrets they weren't yet ready to share, didn't press him further. More than most, she understood that there were parts of a person's past that needed to remain untouched until that person chose the moment to open them, and she respected his silence in the same way. She hoped others would respect her own, because she too carried things she hadn't told. What kept her beside Adrian wasn't what he said about himself, but the way he listened to her, the way he truly looked at her when she spoke, not through her as the rest of the world so often did, but directly at her, as though every word she said deserved to be remembered. He asked about her work with genuine attention, about her patients, about the old medical books on her shelf, about the reason her eyes carried a sorrow she had never explained, and though she didn't tell him everything, she realized that beside him, for the first time in many years, she no longer felt invisible. For Kai, what he found in those simple evenings was more precious than anything power had ever given him, because with her, he wasn't Kai Donovan. Wasn't the name that made people afraid, wasn't the man whose every word carried the weight of life and death. He was simply Adrian, a man sitting over coffee and listening to a woman talk about her night shifts. And within that ordinariness was a freedom he had never known he longed for so deeply. They were two people far too accustomed to carrying their burdens in silence. Two lonely souls in very different ways, she lonely in her invisibility, and he lonely at the height of power. And perhaps that was what drew them together, because each of them saw in the other something no one else had ever cared enough to see. For many months, through the deepening cold of a Chicago winter, those two people built something real and fragile, a love founded not on money or status, or anything that could be held in the hands, but on the simplest and rarest feeling in the world, the feeling of finally being truly seen by another human being. 3 months after that first morning, when he waited for her outside the hospital, when winter had covered Chicago in its first layer of snow, and the feeling between them had grown deep enough for both of them to know that this wasn't something fleeting, Kai Donovan did something even he had never expected himself to do. He asked Naomi to marry him, not with glittering diamonds or an elaborately arranged occasion, but with a rare and naked sincerity from a man who had spent his entire life hiding every emotion he possessed. Yet even in that moment of openness, even as he begged her to become part of his life, he still couldn't give her the whole truth, and it tormented him in a way no enemy ever had. He knew better than anyone that in the world he ruled, a wife wasn't merely a source of happiness. She was a weakness, a target, a thread his enemies could follow, until they reached his heart and closed their hands around it. And he had witnessed too many times what happened to the people men like him dared to love. So when he proposed, he also made a painful request. He asked her to keep their marriage hidden from the entire world, not to wear her wedding ring in public, not to speak his name to anyone, and not to leave behind a single trace that might reveal the connection between them, at least until he had resolved certain matters he vaguely described as things that needed to be cleaned up, matters he couldn't explain more clearly without revealing who he truly was. He told her, in a low, rough voice carrying a pain she had never heard in him before, that his world contained dark corners whose shadows he never wanted to touch her, that this silence wasn't because he was ashamed of her, but because he wanted to protect her from things she didn't yet understand, and he promised that one day he would be able to stand in the light and call her his wife before the whole world. Naomi listened in silence, and perhaps another woman might have felt hurt or suspicious when faced with a proposal burdened by so many conditions and secrets, but she didn't, because she had spent her entire life living quietly in corners no one cared enough to notice, and she had grown accustomed to existing without needing the world to acknowledge that she was there. To her, keeping something precious hidden wasn't a sacrifice. It felt almost natural, because the most precious things in her life, the love she carried for Ruby, her memories of her parents, the pain she bore, were all things she kept within her heart and had never displayed for others to see. She looked into those blue eyes that were usually cold as steel, eyes now fixed upon her with a vulnerability she suspected very few people had ever witnessed, and she understood that whatever he was hiding from her, the love he felt for her was real, and for someone who had learned very young that love always demanded trust and the willingness to let go, that was enough for her to say yes. They married quietly on a cold gray winter afternoon, with only the two of them and a civil official discreetly arranged by Elias, no guests, no celebration, and not a single photograph taken. Naomi wore her wedding ring on a delicate chain hidden beneath her clothing, close to her heart, where no one could see it, but where she could always touch it to remind herself that this was real. In that moment, as she stood beside the man she loved and spoke her vows in a small room with no one there to witness them, Naomi felt a strange and complete happiness, a happiness that needed no recognition from anyone else, and she had no idea that the secrecy she accepted out of love, the very darkness surrounding their marriage, would one day become the deepest wound she would have to carry. When she realized that there were things more painful than being invisible, and one of them was being loved by someone who still chose to keep her in the shadows. What confused Kai Donovan most about the woman he had just married wasn't anything she demanded from him, but the fact that she demanded nothing at all. Throughout his life, he had grown accustomed to everyone around him wanting something, money, protection, a little reflected glow from his power, and he had learned to measure people by the price of what they desired. But Naomi existed beyond every scale he knew. He had offered many times to provide for her, to let her leave behind the exhausting night shifts, to move her out of the cramped apartment above the laundromat, to place at her feet everything his world could buy. But each time she gently refused, not out of pride and not to test his love, but because her work and her independence were part of what made her who she was, and she wouldn't exchange them for any measure of comfort. She told him, in a calm voice carrying something he didn't yet fully understand, that she needed to do her work, that every patient she pulled back from death held a meaning she couldn't put into words, and Kai, though he didn't completely understand, respected it, because he sensed that behind her need to hold on was an old wound she was quietly trying to heal in her own way. He didn't know that for Naomi, every night shift was a silent act of atonement. Every life she saved a small piece of the debt she had placed upon her own shoulders many years before, and would continue paying until the end of her life, that she worked not for money, but for something far deeper, a need to stand once more on the line between life and death, and this time refuse to let death win. But while Naomi was determined to preserve her independence, Kai had his own way of loving a woman who wouldn't allow herself to be loved openly, and he did it in the only way he knew, in darkness, quietly, without needing recognition. He knew about Ruby, knew about the girl's fragile heart, and the mounting medical bills Naomi continued to carry in silence, and without saying a word to his wife, he arranged for every expense of Ruby's treatment to be paid discreetly, allowing Naomi to believe that insurance had covered everything, so she could sleep a little more peacefully, without ever knowing who stood behind it. He didn't do it to make her indebted to him, nor to gain anything from her, but simply because it was the only way he could touch her life, without breaking the independence she treasured. A gift offered in silence by a man who had spent his whole life knowing only how to give by taking, and who was now learning how to give without anyone knowing. But there was something that troubled him even more deeply than the medical bills, something he had learned by chance through the discreet inquiries of his men, the story of her mother's ring, the final keepsake from a family she had lost, which Naomi had been forced to sell during her most desperate days in order to fight for her sister's life. When Kai heard that story, something inside his chest, something he had believed hardened long ago, tightened painfully, because he understood better than anyone what it meant to let go of a piece of one's past, and he knew exactly what he had to do. He had his men trace the ring through pawnshops across the city, patiently and meticulously, the way he approached everything that truly mattered, until they discovered it still resting inside a dusty glass case in a shop on an old street, and he bought it back without a moment's hesitation over the price. But he didn't give it to Naomi immediately, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to wait for a moment worthy of it, a day when he could stand before her with nothing left concealed and return to her not only a ring, but the truth of who he was. And until that day came, he kept her mother's ring in his coat pocket, close beside him, like a promise he still hadn't found the courage to speak aloud. While Kai quietly wove an invisible net of protection around his wife's life, within the very hospital where Naomi worked, another kind of pressure was slowly tightening around her. A pressure that didn't come from enemies in the shadows, but from people in white coats walking beneath the daylight. The one who set it in motion was Celeste Marchetti, a young surgeon born into a distinguished medical family, a woman who carried the confidence of someone who had never been forced to fight for anything in her life. And for reasons she didn't even bother to conceal, Celeste couldn't tolerate Naomi's quiet presence. Perhaps it was because patients always spoke the night nurse's name, with a warmth no doctor could purchase with credentials. Perhaps it was because there was something in Naomi's humble composure that made Celeste's showy pride seem cheap. But whatever the reason, Celeste chose Naomi as the target of her subtle barbs. She had a way of humiliating people without ever using a single openly rude word, remarks carefully wrapped in smiles, questions that sounded like concern but were really needles. As when she complimented Naomi on how well her scrubs still held their shape despite being so old, or when she wondered with false innocence how Naomi could bear taking the train at 5 o'clock in the morning when everyone else had owned a car for years. And wherever Celeste was, Preston Wexley was usually nearby, the honorary head of the hospital's fundraising board, a man who had built his entire identity around standing beside people he considered important. And he laughed at every one of Celeste's insults, not because he was truly cruel, but because he was a coward who always chose the side of the laughter rather than risk becoming its target. But there was something else about Preston, something no one noticed at the time, and that was the strange questions he had begun asking Naomi in recent weeks. Questions that went far beyond ordinary curiosity, probing into her private life, whether she knew anyone outside the hospital, whether she had relatives or friends in business, whether there was anyone special in her life. Questions she dismissed as nothing more than the irritating nosiness of a man who enjoyed interfering in other people's affairs, never suspecting that something far darker stood behind them. Preston, always short of money and desperate to maintain his extravagant lifestyle, had recently begun accepting secret payments from a power he didn't dare name, in exchange for quietly watching hospital employees who might have connections to what those paying him called the outside world, and he had no idea that he was following a thread leading directly into the center of a war in which he had no place. Naomi, for her part, received every cutting remark and intrusive question the same way she received everything else in life, with silence. She didn't answer back, didn't explain herself, didn't allow them to see even the briefest flicker of hurt cross her face, and that silence wasn't a sign of weakness, as they mistakenly believed, but a deliberate choice refined over many years, because she had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting with words, that true dignity didn't lie in responding to every insult, but in refusing to let those insults define who she was. Yet even someone as strong and patient as Naomi couldn't remain completely untouched, and every cruel remark, every contemptuous glance, every burst of laughter behind her back, though she never allowed any of it to disturb her outward calm, still gathered quietly inside her, one layer upon another, like an invisible weight pressing down on the shoulders of someone already carrying far too much. A weight she took home each night to her small apartment without telling anyone about it, not even the man she called her husband. Preston's intrusive questions, as it turned out, were only one small link in a net being quietly drawn around Naomi without her knowledge. And only a few days before that fateful night, the net tightened closer than ever. Elias Thorne was the one who brought the bad news to Kai late one evening, his usually composed face now marked by a gravity he rarely allowed anyone to see. And in a low voice he said that the Kessler family's suspicions had finally hardened into something concrete, that they had traced evidence of a woman's existence in Kai's life, and worse, that they had begun fitting the pieces together to discover who she was. For Kai. Hearing those words felt like the ground collapsing beneath his feet, because this was exactly what he had feared for months, the very reason he had kept his marriage hidden in darkness, and now the darkness he had created to protect her was in danger of becoming useless against his enemy's pursuit. He understood that any contact between them now, any meeting, any phone call made without perfect caution, could become the thread that led his enemies directly to her door, and so he did the most painful thing love sometimes demanded. He withdrew, kept his distance, and disappeared from her life for a time, hoping to mislead those searching for her. He couldn't explain the true reason for his sudden absence without exposing the entire truth, and so he remained silent, leaving her to face her most difficult days alone, unaware that her husband was standing guard in the shadows, tormented by the fact that he couldn't be beside her. And cruelly enough, this was precisely when Naomi needed him more than ever, because Ruby's fragile heart began troubling her again, not severely enough to place her life in immediate danger, but enough to require several days in the hospital for observation. Enough to send Naomi back into those familiar cold waiting rooms where she sat for hours with shadows beneath her eyes, worrying for her sister while still carrying shifts she couldn't afford to miss. She sent messages to Adrian, the man whose true identity she still didn't know, and her messages received only brief and infrequent replies, distant words that tightened her heart with a fear she didn't dare name. The fear that perhaps this man, like every other good thing that had ever entered her life, would eventually leave her too. She had no idea that his distance was an act of protection rather than rejection, and in that ignorance she carried everything alone, as she always had. The pressure gathered from consecutive night shifts, from her fear for Ruby, from the cruel remarks at the hospital, and from the bewildering silence of the man she loved, all of it bearing down at once upon a body already drained to its limits. And one morning, after an endlessly long shift, as she dragged herself into the empty staff changing room, the world suddenly tilted around her. The walls seemed to lean, darkness rushed inward from the edges of her vision, and she crumpled onto the cold tile floor, unconscious and alone. When she woke a few minutes later in the empty room, her body trembling and cold sweat covering her skin, the first thing she did wasn't call for help or seek out a colleague to lean on. She forced herself upright, gripping the locker for support, drew a deep breath to steady herself, then straightened her uniform and wiped every trace of weakness from her face. She hid everything, just as she had hidden every other wound in her life, because she had long believed that if she allowed herself to fall even once, everyone depending on her would fall with her. And so the woman stood upright once more, swallowed her exhaustion, and walked out of the room as though nothing had happened, carrying inside her chest one more secret she wouldn't tell anyone. And then came that night, the night when all the invisible threads woven over so many months would finally draw together into a net of fate. The night that began with the hospital's annual charity gala, held in the magnificent ballroom of one of the city's most luxurious hotels. The entire space was bathed in warm golden light spilling from crystal chandeliers suspended high above, while a string quartet played melodies soft enough to form a graceful backdrop beneath the murmur of conversation, and throughout the room stood members of the medical and financial elite, celebrated physicians in expensive formal wear, donors with polished smiles, men and women accustomed to being admired. Amid all that splendor, Naomi entered in a simple gray dress, the finest thing she owned, and she had come not because she longed to belong to this world, but because the hospital had invited her to be honored as a devoted employee, an invitation she couldn't refuse, even though she knew in her heart how painfully out of place she would feel. What no one in that room knew, what no one had even cared enough to ask, was that tonight was her birthday. She had just turned 27, and throughout the entire long day, not a single birthday wish had reached her, no one had remembered, and she had trained herself not to expect it so thoroughly that the loneliness had become less a wound than a quiet habit. In her hands was the gift she had brought for the evening, a picture frame she had spent many silent nights preparing, and inside it there was no painting and no photograph, but a list written carefully in her own hand, the names of patients who had passed through her intensive care unit over the years and hadn't been able to remain, people beside whom she had sat during their final hours, whose hands she had held when there was no one else left to hold them. She brought that list as a quiet reminder to all the powerful people in the room that every name upon it had once been a life, a human being worthy of being remembered. She didn't know, and couldn't know until it was too late, that among those carefully written names was one bearing the Donovan surname, a young man named Reese, whom she had cared for during his final nights many years earlier, a name lost among so many others, and carrying no special meaning for her now, but one that would shake the entire room when its moment came. She stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, trying to make herself smaller among the laughter and conversations in which she had no place. And she had hoped to pass through the evening unnoticed before slipping away. But that world wouldn't allow someone like her to remain in peace. It was Celeste Marchetti, dazzling in an expensive gown and already softened by wine, who first noticed her presence and decided to turn her into entertainment for the crowd. She raised her voice just enough for a nearby group of guests to hear, and asked with false surprise what kind of gift a night shift nurse could possibly bring to an elegant evening like this. A question that seemed harmless, but was delivered with exactly enough cruelty to awaken the idle curiosity of those who were bored. Eyes began turning toward Naomi and the small gift in her hands. Whispers spread through the room, and someone in the crowd, encouraged by alcohol and the effortless cruelty of a group, called out that Preston, the man of the evening, should open the gift in front of everyone. The moment the suggestion was made, a curious and malicious silence began spreading across the ballroom, announcing that the prey had been chosen and the amusement was about to begin. Encouraged by the attention of the crowd and the wine flowing through his veins, Preston Wexley stepped forward with the smile of a man, certain that the entire room was waiting for him to perform, and he began opening the gifts arranged on the table covered in white cloth, with the deliberate manner of someone determined to prolong every second of being the center of attention. He opened the lavish gifts from the donors first, a rare bottle of wine specially ordered from a celebrated vineyard, an expensive watch glittering beneath the chandeliers, a donation check bearing a figure that drew murmurs of admiration from the crowd, and after each gift, he lifted his head to receive the applause like an actor accepting flowers on stage. Then he picked up Naomi's small, simply wrapped frame, and the moment he opened it and saw a handwritten list of names instead of some luxurious offering, his expression shifted from curiosity to undisguised contempt. He raised the frame high enough for the entire room to see, then spoke into the microphone, his voice carrying across the ballroom, asking what this was supposed to be, a list of dead people, and whether this was truly what she believed appropriate to bring to an evening that was meant to be filled with joy. Laughter erupted throughout the room, a cruel sound cutting through the expectant silence like a cold blade, and Preston, strengthened by that laughter, turned and compared Naomi with Celeste, who was standing nearby. He told everyone to look at the difference between a woman who truly belonged in this world and someone who had merely wandered into it by accident, that some people were born to shine in rooms like this, while others were meant to remain forever at their edges. Every word he spoke was another cut, and he told her, loudly enough that even the string quartet stopped playing, that she had made herself into a laughingstock, that she had never belonged there and never would, and that perhaps it was time she finally understood her proper place. Then, as though he wanted to seal the humiliation with an act that could never be erased, he opened his fingers and allowed the frame to fall freely onto the marble floor, and in that moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath as the glass struck the ground and shattered into a web of cracks, a small but piercing sound that rang far louder than a piece of glass should have been capable of making, a sound many people in that ballroom would continue to hear in their memories for a long time afterward. 2 security guards, responding to a slight motion of Preston's head, began moving toward Naomi with the blank expressions of men paid not to ask questions, ready to escort her out of the gala, as though she were an inconvenience that needed to be removed. And several guests raised their phones to record the scene, some laughing openly, others remaining silent with the discomfort of people witnessing cruelty, but lacking the courage to stop it. But Naomi didn't run, didn't cry, and didn't beg. She simply knelt in the middle of the room beneath all those searching eyes, and with the steady hands long accustomed to caring for fragile things, she gathered the broken glass and the frame, holding it against her chest as though it were still whole, as though the names inside still deserved to be protected. Then she slowly rose, straightening her back within the heavy silence closing around her, and she looked directly into Preston's eyes for so long that the smile on his lips faltered for an instant before she spoke, her voice strangely calm and quiet, carrying none of the anger the room expected. Only 3 words, "I understand now." She offered no explanation. Then she turned, walked past the 2 security guards, who now stood frozen and uncertain whether they were still needed, and began crossing the length of the ballroom toward the doors. But Naomi hadn't yet crossed the full distance to the door when that very door opened before her, and everything in the room changed within a single heartbeat. The towering ballroom doors swung inward from the outside, and through them stepped a group of men dressed in dark formal attire, moving with the quiet precision of people accustomed to controlling every space they entered, led by Elias Thorne, his face composed yet grave. They didn't call out, didn't announce themselves, and didn't speak a single loud word about who they were or whom they had come to find, because men like them didn't need sound to command the attention of an entire room. They had come, in truth, for an urgent purpose no guest could have guessed, to remove Naomi from this place, and take her somewhere safe before their enemies had time to act. But their silent and powerful arrival caused the laughter that had filled the ballroom only moments earlier to die completely, and without warning, as though someone had suddenly pulled all the air from the room. Then, behind Elias, another man stepped across the threshold, tall and composed, wearing a dark overcoat. And although not everyone in the room knew who he was, the reaction of the few who recognized him revealed everything. A donor standing near the banquet table hurriedly set down his wineglass with a trembling hand. A prominent man from the financial world went pale and took a step backward, as though trying to disappear into the crowd. That bloodless expression spread from one face to another like a cold wave, because anyone who had ever heard the name Kai Donovan, spoken behind closed doors, understood that this man's presence was never an accident. Preston, still standing there with the remains of laughter on his lips, sensed the change in the atmosphere without understanding its cause, and he opened his mouth to demand who these men were and what business they had at his gala. But Kai's blue eyes, cold as steel, passed over him once, only once, and the words died on his tongue. Yet Kai didn't look at Preston for long, didn't look at the stunned crowd, and didn't look at Celeste, who stood frozen in disbelief, because from the moment he entered, his gaze had been drawn toward the woman standing in the middle of the ballroom, with a shattered picture frame clutched tightly in her hands, the woman he loved. Then his eyes lowered, falling upon the broken glass and the sheet of white paper exposed beneath the cracked surface, upon the lines of carefully handwritten names laid bare beneath the chandeliers. For one moment, time seemed to stop for Kai Donovan, because among those unfamiliar names, his eyes found one he would have recognized anywhere and under any circumstances, Rhys Donovan. The name of the younger brother he had lost many years earlier, the brother he hadn't been able to stand beside during his final hours, because the dark business of his life had carried him far away on that fateful night. And the regret of that absence was the one wound neither power nor time had ever been able to heal. In a single instant, the truth came crashing down upon him with the weight of an entire building collapsing, because he understood that this woman, the wife he had married in darkness, was the nameless nurse who had sat beside his brother when he couldn't, the woman who had held Rhys's hand through the final nights he could never reclaim. And suddenly his entire life, every scattered piece of it, locked into place in one dizzying and suffocating moment of pain. The man an entire city feared, the man who had never revealed even a flicker of emotion before an enemy, walked forward through the silent room and slowly lowered himself onto one knee on the marble floor before Naomi. Under the astonished gaze of 200 people, he reached out with hands accustomed to granting both life and death, hands now trembling with gentleness, and carefully lifted each shard of broken glass from her palms, as though she were the most fragile and precious thing he had ever touched. And the tenderness of such a man made the entire room shudder. When Kai had removed the final shards of glass from Naomi's palms and rose to his feet, slowly and deliberately, the entire ballroom remained submerged in absolute silence, the silence of people who had just realized that the ground beneath them was no longer what they had believed it to be. He turned toward Preston and didn't raise his voice or reveal even the faintest trace of anger, because those who truly possessed power had never needed noise, and in a low, quiet tone that nevertheless reached every corner of the room through that stillness, he said that the woman Preston had just cast down onto the floor, along with that picture frame, had devoted her entire life to sitting beside people the world had forgotten, to holding the hands no one else was willing to hold, and that the list he had mocked wasn't some ordinary gift, but proof of something his entire fortune could never purchase, a heart capable of recognizing the worth of another human being, even when that person had nothing left to give. Then Kai continued, and his voice now carried a colder edge, saying that Preston might want to ask himself why he had been entrusted with organizing this particular gala, why someone had paid him to watch certain employees at the hospital, and whether he had ever considered the consequences of selling himself to forces whose names he didn't even dare speak aloud. Each of Kai's words fell into place like another piece of a puzzle, and Preston's face drained of color little by little as he understood that the money he had accepted in secret, the intrusive questions he had been instructed to ask, the gala he had imagined was meant to honor him, all of it had been part of a game far larger than he had ever realized, a game in which he had been nothing more than a pawn, used to search for the weakness of the man now standing directly before him. The humiliation he had inflicted upon Naomi, as it turned out, had never been part of the plan devised by those controlling him. It had simply been the product of his own cowardice and arrogance, a foolish act that had accidentally dragged into the light the very secret his employers had spent so long trying to uncover. And now he stood there exposed as both a traitor and a fool beneath the contempt of the entire room. Not far away, Celeste Marchetti stood frozen, her wineglass nearly slipping from fingers that had gone numb, her face, so often arranged in self-satisfaction, now bloodless as she realized that the woman she had mocked, belittled, and turned into entertainment, for months, was the very woman whose husband could destroy both her career and the distinguished family name she treasured, with no more than a slight tightening of his expression. But the most striking thing in that moment wasn't Preston's collapse or Celeste's terror. It was Naomi who remained standing quietly amid it all. And she didn't wear the expression of someone who had just discovered a devastating truth about her husband. Because the truth was that she had suspected for a long time. The pieces of Adrian's real identity had slowly taken shape in her mind over the past several months, and she had carried those suspicions in silence. What shook her now wasn't who he was, but the vastness of the world he had hidden from her, the scale of the power and danger now exposed in the middle of this public place, and the way the truth she had quietly held for so long had been dragged into the light with such cruelty and such finality before 200 strangers, on the very birthday no one had remembered. She looked at the man standing before her, the man who had just knelt to gather broken glass from her hands, and in her weary gray eyes there was no surprise, only a sorrow so deep it seemed without end, and a silent question she hadn't yet spoken, a question about how many more things between them had always remained in darkness, and whether a love built upon so many unspoken truths could survive once the light finally reached it. Even in that storm of emotion, Kai Donovan didn't forget who he was or how dangerous his world had always been, and with a slight motion of his head, almost too subtle to notice, he signaled to his men, who immediately moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, collecting every phone that had recorded the moment he entered and knelt down, erasing every trace that might reveal the connection between him and the woman in the gray dress, because he understood that Naomi's identity now needed protection more than ever. The only recordings that remained and would spread throughout the city in the days that followed showed Preston Wexley humiliating a devoted nurse in the middle of the gala, without a single frame of what happened afterward, and that would become his downfall, not by Kai's hand, but through the natural consequences of his own cruelty. But before that night could end, a more immediate danger was waiting outside, because after months of searching, the Kessler family had finally identified the weakness they had been hunting for, and they had chosen this very night to strike, believing that amid the confusion of the gala, they could reach and seize the woman Kai Donovan treasured. As Elias escorted Naomi out of the ballroom through a side passage toward the waiting cars, Kessler's men emerged from an ambush in the darkness of the underground parking garage, and in that instant, the man who had always controlled everything from a distance, who had always allowed others to carry out the dangerous work in his place, didn't hesitate before throwing himself forward and placing his own body between Naomi and the threat. The confrontation was swift and violent beneath the dim lights of the basement, and Kai fought not with the cold calculation he usually displayed in his world, but with something entirely different, the recklessness of a man protecting the only precious thing left in his life. Though his men quickly overpowered the attackers, he didn't escape without paying a price. A wound in his side left him staggering and bracing himself against the cold concrete wall when the struggle was over. And in that moment, when the attackers had been subdued and a tense silence returned, Naomi did what the deepest instinct within her commanded. She didn't panic, didn't freeze in fear, but immediately went to the wounded man and knelt beside him, with the calm of someone who had spent her entire life standing at the boundary between life and death. The hands that had cared for countless patients now moved swiftly and steadily. She tore a strip of cloth from his own overcoat to stop the bleeding, pressed against the wound with exactly the force required, and her voice returned to the calm, professional tone he had heard during those rainy nights in the intensive care unit months earlier, as she told him to look into her eyes and breathe evenly, that she was there and wouldn't let anything happen to him. And in that moment, a strange circle of fate closed, because this was the second time this woman had bandaged this man, the second time she had held him back from the edge with her gentle hands. Except that the first time she had saved a nameless stranger, while now she was saving the husband she loved, the man she had just realized she had never truly understood. Kai looked at her through the haze of pain, at her focused face and hands that didn't tremble, and among everything that had collapsed that night, something in his chest still tightened with a feeling almost like gratitude, because even after everything he had hidden from her, even after the world he had built had revealed itself before her, in the cruelest possible way, she was still there, still choosing to save him. And he understood that this woman possessed a strength his entire empire could never match, a compassion that never asked whether the person before her deserved mercy, but simply did what was right. He knew that this was what had made him love her, and it was also what made him fear that he had wounded her beyond repair. Many hours later, after Kai's wound had been treated and the immediate danger had receded, when the two of them were finally alone in the stillness of a secure room his men had arranged, all that remained between them was the naked truth they had both avoided for far too long. Kai began to speak, his voice roughened by pain, and by something heavier than pain, saying that he was sorry he had hidden his true identity from her, that he had done it only to protect her, to keep the darkness of his world from reaching her. But Naomi interrupted him, not with anger, but with a calmness that hurt him more deeply than any accusation could have. She told him that she had known, that she had begun to understand nearly 3 months earlier, when the pieces had slowly emerged in ways she could no longer ignore. The quiet men who always appeared at the edges of her vision whenever they were together. Ruby's medical bills disappearing, in ways she knew her insurance couldn't possibly explain, the way an entire crowded room seemed to soften whenever he entered. She had put everything together and understood, she said, but she had chosen silence, chosen not to ask, chosen to wait, because she wanted to believe that one day he would come to her of his own will and tell her the truth. Not because he was forced to, not because he was exposed before 200 strangers, but because he trusted her enough to place his real self in her hands. And that, she said, her voice trembling for the first time that night, was what truly hurt her, not who he was, not the dangerous world in which he lived, not the power or the secrets or the danger, but the fact that she had quietly given him so much time to choose to trust her, and he had never done it until circumstances left him no other choice. Then Naomi spoke aloud the things she had carried inside herself for her entire life, the oldest pain she had never confessed to anyone. She told him that she had spent her whole life as someone no one cared enough to see, a quiet shadow passing through rooms and through other people's lives without leaving a mark, and she had believed that when she met him, she had finally found someone who truly saw her, someone beside whom she was no longer invisible. But now she understood, she said, that he had loved her in the way of a man who always stood in darkness, keeping her hidden and safe, but hidden all the same, and that was only another form of invisibility. What she had longed for had never been a man who could silence an entire room for her, never an empire or a power capable of punishing those who had humiliated her. What she needed, she told him with a sincerity that broke his heart, was simply someone who would sit beside her in a hospital waiting room. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when she was exhausted and frightened and alone, someone who would hold her hand not to protect her from an enemy, but only so she wouldn't have to be by herself. Someone who would stay, simply stay, when there was no enemy to fight and no danger from which she needed to be rescued. when there was only the unguarded ordinariness of a life that needed to be shared. Kai listened in silence, and the man who had never known helplessness now felt it rising inside his chest like a tide, because he understood that all his power, everything he could buy, command, destroy, or protect, became meaningless before the one thing this woman had truly needed. Something so simple he had never thought of it, his presence, and he realized that through all those months, while he had been so consumed with building walls to shelter her, he had missed the chance to do the simplest thing of all, to be beside her. But fate, as though it still hadn't finished with Naomi during that endless night, struck her once more when her phone rang with an emergency call from the hospital, and the voice on the other end told her that Ruby's fragile heart was no longer suffering through another temporary episode, but had entered a true crisis, that the girl needed surgery that very night if she was to have any chance of surviving. In that moment, everything that had just happened, the betrayal, the secrets dragged into the light, the wound inside her, the confrontation in the underground garage, all of it vanished from Naomi's mind, because there had never been a choice for her to consider. Whenever Ruby needed her, and she sprang to her feet and rushed into the night toward the hospital, toward the younger sister who had been her entire world since that terrible night of fire and smoke so many years before. And this time, unlike all the lonely nights that had come before, someone quietly followed her, not with an entourage or a line of black cars, not with the bearing of a powerful man an entire city feared, but simply as a man walking beside the woman he loved. And Kai entered that familiar hospital waiting room, as the Adrian he had been in the beginning, setting aside even the wound in his side that had yet to heal so he could be there with her. He didn't say much, didn't offer hollow promises, and didn't use his power to demand the finest doctors or the most expensive treatments. Though he was more than capable of doing all of it, he simply lowered himself into the hard plastic chair beside her, in that cold waiting room beneath the fluorescent lights, and he stayed hour after hour, as the clock moved past 3:00 in the morning, the loneliest hour she had spoken of, the hour she had faced alone for so many years. In the tense stillness of that night, while they waited together for news from the operating room, Kai quietly reached into his coat pocket and took out the small object he had carried with him for months, the thin gold ring worn smooth by the years, her mother's ring, the one she had been forced to sell during her most desperate days, and he placed it in her palm without saying a word, allowing the object itself to tell its story. Naomi looked down at the ring in her hand, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, because she recognized it instantly, the final keepsake from her family that she had believed was lost forever, now resting once more in the center of her palm. When she looked up at him with eyes overflowing with questions, Kai quietly told her the truth he had kept hidden, that he had followed the ring's trail through pawn shops across the city until he found it, that he had bought it back months earlier and kept it with him while waiting for a moment worthy of returning it to her. Then he confessed the final truth, that he was the one who had quietly paid Ruby's medical bills all those months, that the insurance coverage she had believed in had never existed, and that he had done all of it in silence, not to make her indebted to him, but because it was the only way he knew how to love her, without intruding upon the independence she treasured. Hearing those words, Naomi finally understood something that had always been there without her ever seeing it, that throughout all the time she had believed she was fighting alone, this man had always been beside her, only hidden in the darkness, standing guard where she couldn't see him, carrying part of her burden without allowing her to know. And the tears she had held back through an entire lifetime of endurance finally slipped silently down her face, not because of pain, but because of a truth both tender and heartbreaking, that she had been loved more deeply than she had ever known, only in a way she had never been able to see. When the first rays of dawn began slipping through the waiting room windows, and a doctor emerged with a weary but relieved smile, telling them that the surgery had been successful, and Ruby was going to survive, Naomi sat there with her mother's ring in one hand and her husband's hand in the other, and for the first time in many years, she no longer felt that she had to face the world alone. Several months passed after that fateful night, and the city of Chicago continued its hurried rhythm, indifferent to the quiet changes unfolding inside two human hearts. And one early morning, they found each other again in the very hospital intensive care unit where everything had begun, where Ruby was now recovering a little more each day after her surgery. Color returned to her face along with her smile, and the heart that had once been so fragile now beat with a steadiness and strength greater than ever before. In the gentle stillness of that morning, Naomi finally asked the question she had carried inside herself for so many days, the question whose answer she needed to hear not so she could accuse him, but so she could understand. She asked whether, if she had been nothing more than a strange nurse he had never seen again, not his wife, with no bond of any kind connecting them, he would still have walked through that door for her that night. Kai was silent for a moment, then he looked directly into her gray eyes and answered with a sincerity she had never seen in him before. He said he hadn't entered that room because she was his wife, but because she was the only person in the world who had ever truly seen him when he was nothing at all, when he was only a nameless man lying in a hospital bed, without power, without status, with nothing to offer except the fragile fact of his own existence, and she had treated that man with unconditional kindness. He said that throughout his entire life, people had seen him only because of what he possessed or because of what they feared, and she had been the first and only person to see the human being beneath all those layers. His greatest regret, he told her, wasn't that he had loved her, but that it had taken him so long to learn how to see her in the same way she had once seen him. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She didn't rush to forgive him, nor did she hurry to close wounds that still needed time to heal, because she understood that once trust had been shaken, it had to be rebuilt one brick at a time and couldn't be restored by a single sentence, no matter how sincere. But she allowed him to remain beside her that morning. She allowed her hand to rest quietly in his, and for two people who had endured so much pain, that was already a beginning. As for Kai, he had begun a quiet but determined journey of change. He removed the cruelest links from the world he had built, slowly loosened his grip on the work that had once been fine, and discreetly devoted part of his enormous fortune to funding the cardiology department of that very hospital, so children and adults with fragile hearts like Ruby's could receive chances their families might never have been able to afford, not because he was trying to atone to anyone, but because for the first time in his life, he had truly understood what the woman beside him had taught him, that a person's worth wasn't measured by how useful they were or how much power they held. And as the warm light of dawn poured through the waiting room windows, illuminating the faces of two people who had traveled through darkness together to find their way toward the light, their story left all of us with something to consider, because what remained after everything wasn't power, money, or revenge, but a simple and profound truth that the true measure of a human being isn't found in how they treat the powerful people whose favor they need, but in how they treat the person standing before them when they believe that person is no one at all, has nothing to give, and can offer them no advantage. The dignity Naomi preserved in the face of humiliation, the kindness she gave, even when no one was watching, and the tenderness she offered to those the world had forgotten, proved that sometimes the quietest and most humble people carry within them a nobility no amount of power can purchase, and that sincere compassion will always be worth more than every fortune on earth. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so that together we can continue listening to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how Naomi and Kai's story made you feel, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share the thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because every word you write is a precious source of encouragement to us. Thank you for listening until the very final moment, and we wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.